for the CSE this spring. So today it's a pleasure to have Alán with us. So he was supposed to join us in person, but because of the snowstorm, he had to cancel the plans. But still, we are very happy that he's here, even if virtually. So Alán is the professor of chemistry and computer science at the University of Toronto. He's also the Canada 150 Research Chair in Theoretical Chemistry and a Canada CIFAR AI Chair at the Vector Institute. So Alán got his undergrad from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and then he moved to Berkeley, University of Berkeley, California, for his PhD that he got in 2004. He spent some time there as a postdoctoral fellow, and then moved to Harvard University, where he was actually a full professor from 2013 to then 2018. So I think that Alán today is going to talk about his research that is at the interface of quantum information, machine learning, and chemistry. So if you just read the announcement, you could say like it's a very outstanding researcher. And I think that we are all looking forward to see what we can learn from the talk. So a few things about the logistics. So usually we'll take the questions at the end. If you have questions, you can also write those in the chat. And then at the very end, I'll read the questions to Alán. So without any further ado, Alán, whenever you want, go ahead.
Thank you, Adrian. And yes, I was very sad because I ended up seeing my schedule with a bunch of my old friends. When I used to be at Harvard before moving to Toronto, I like to say that the best thing about Harvard is having MIT next door because they're such a great colleagues over there. So sorry that I miss you all, my friends there. But you know, it was very risky to travel during these crazy snowstorm days. So today I'm going to give you, because I know this is a multidisciplinary audience, kind of like a bird's eye view of what we've been working on self-driving labs. I see some local experts like my colleague and friend Connor Conley are in the audience. So you have a huge representation at MIT on this topic. Professor Klaus Jensen, Connor Conley, and others. Rafa Gomez Bombarelli are in this area. So if you want to learn about it, you can also contact them. They are fantastic people. So, well, I mean, the common task that many of us are actually trying to tackle is the gap between an idea in science, in this particular case, molecules and materials, and their development. And this process, if you look historically at all sorts of materials, going down from membranes using batteries, all the way up to semiconductors, all the way down to catalyzers for chemical processes. All of these take about 25 years to go to market once the idea is coming up in a lab and scaled up. And many of the issues is that the fact that the conception, the synthesis, the characterization, the scaling are disconnected and are linear. Okay, so this kind of funnel-like process, which is also very common to pharma as well, it's kind of slow, and we don't have time in this modern world to actually make it work. I want to show you just one example, just to motivate how I started thinking about self-driving labs, and also in general the industry. If I was there in person, I would have asked you how many of you have an OLED cell phone, a Samsung or an iPhone, and I would probably think 80% of you or 90% of you would have raised your hands. And this technology actually was discovered in 1987. And it is a timeline where I really like it because the scientific discovery led to something that was commercialized exactly 20 years later, the Samsung OLED phone. And is it interesting? Well, I mean, this company called Universal Display Corporation holds the intellectual property of the OLEDs, basically globally. And at the time I took this slide about a year ago. I don't know what is the price right now, but it was a strong buy with a PE ratio of 40, right? So it's a very good stock for a company that the only thing they do is materials IP. Now, it took 20 years to get there, right? So there's many incumbents that want to change that. So this is an oldie but goodie that I brought back up because my former co-worker in my lab, a postdoc in my lab, now is a professor at MIT, Rafa led this study in my lab that actually changed the way I think about science. And the reason this project was so important to me is Samsung, one of the incumbents that wanted to develop their own materials, hired us at Harvard and MIT as hired guns to actually do computational screening of, in that case, about 1 million compounds. to try to find good OLED materials. And it took a project about 3 years. It was actually the first project in my lab that we really used machine learning to down select compounds and very early models of machine learning. And then those became 30 devices that were tested. And I know this story is almost getting to be a decade old, but it really made me think around 2017 that I needed a lab, right? It's not possible just to do this in the abstract. And that's where I started looking at the work of people like Klaus Jensen at MIT and others that already had gone in this path. The way we think about this is the idea of the self-driving laboratory, right? So I like the name. This is coined by my friend Benji Maruyama at the Air Force. If you have a car that is actually driving on the road and it's making decisions as the input data is coming in, you're going to call it self-driving, right? It's making this decision, it's driving through the road. Instead of thinking about driving through a road, you might want to think about driving through chemical space. And as you drive through chemical space, you might want to then think about what is the next molecule or material I'm going to be testing, okay? And what are the optimal conditions for the particular experiment I want to make based on the data I just got? This is opposed to high throughput screening, which comes all the way down since the 60s, I would say, but of course popularized in the 80s and so on. A combinatorial chemistry where people did a lot of experiments and then did very simple data science and simple correlations after them. Here we're really talking about handful of experiments at a time, maybe 100, 50, 10, or it could be 1,000 even, but every time you do an experiment, then you actually make a decision about what to do next. So it's more efficient in terms of, for example, materials, and it's more efficient in terms of being targeted. So now I want to talk a little bit about machine learning for molecular design, again, starting with the oldest but goodies and go to the current state. And then I'm going to go into the self-driving labs, just very briefly, right? So again, this is a paper led by Rafa, and now my own colleague, David Duvenot, here as well at Computer Science in Toronto, and many others. But what we did here was the first time one actually used a generative model in chemistry to do what is called inverse design. What is inverse design is if you have the properties of a particular molecule or material that you want, you might want to try to find out what molecule has those properties. And usually most of the other maps are actually unidirectional to take you from structure to property, but from property back to molecule, that's ill-defined, right? But if you have a reversible map like this autoencoder that encodes and decodes into this so-called latent space that many of you probably are familiar, then you can actually link the latent space to a model, optimizing that model, and then develop a molecule. And this paper has been cited, I would say, 2,000-3,000 times. I don't remember. Right? It's quite a lot of attention in the last 5 years because really many people started working in that area. And in this recent review that we put out 2 years ago, we just say, well, of course, that's not the only way to generate an inverse design problem. You could imagine using so-called GANs and, of course, genetic algorithms, right? So actually, my lab has some genetic algorithms that beat these other models in many contexts. So I am really very, very not married to a particular AI model. I like to say, and many people in AI probably share the same thing, that there is a hierarchy of problems, right? And the first hierarchy, of course, is having good data. We'll get back to it. The second problem is having a good representation. And then the model is first, right? Third. And those are the kinds of things you want to think about. Now, is AI-driven molecular discovery or AI-driven materials discovery a thing? Well, here's an example. Back in 2019, ourselves, and then also Regina's lab, also at MIT, 1 year later, basically demonstrated that if you use a generative model, you can actually very quickly iterate. In this case, we used actually human robots, humans at a company called Wuxi, to make the compounds, test them in cells and livers of rats, and come up with a very simple but still valid lead discovery candidate for a drug. And that paper in 2019 was the first of a series of papers, and now have validated drug discovery with AI in several different areas. I hear from my friend Jason Hein that aspects of the Paxlovid molecule were done with AI. So even your therapeutics for COVID. Not necessarily the whole workflow, but as I understand, there were some aspects done with it. We just recently, just about 3 weeks ago or so maybe this paper already has page numbers, continued the work with in silico, trying to show how convergence of AI models gives you faster and faster progress. So in this case, we used AI 3 times, okay? AI to use unsupervised learning on chemical patient data and literature data to identify a new target for liver cancer, this protein CDK20. And this target, after being identified, it was not identified before this omics study, we wanted a target, though, that was not having a 3-dimensional folder structure. Because what the goal of this paper is to show that when you generate a molecule and you go now after an AI-inspired protein structure, that you could, in principle, now filter candidates that bind to that, AI predicted 3-dimensional structure, and then see if you can actually develop a drug. And these lead candidates came out with very good binding constants, and they were published as world, this is what we can do now with AI and AlphaFold. Notice that this is not in Nature Science or something like that. It's in a journal that is more routine, Chemical Science. And that's important. That means that even this new development of using AlphaFold, which we thought was very important, these papers are now so routine that now you're starting to see them in this type of journals, right? It's now a story that many people can tell you about, this AI discovered materials and drugs. So, well, what other things can you do, right? So that was a drug, but I want to talk about materials in general, and I'm very interested in them in general. This paper, a couple years old, still is one of my favorites because we had to use descriptors for molecules, which are these linkers, and for metals, which are this kind of vertices, in periodic structure. So we had to figure out how to describe the periodic structure to create a model for these molecular sponges. I know this is a very multidisciplinary seminar. These reticular materials, you can think about them as molecular structures that have a lot of empty air or empty space for solvent. And they're used, for example, for separations in chemical reactions. They're used for sucking toxic things from the air, and they're used for recycling and for a lot of things, okay? As catalysts, just because it's very valid it's very nice to have a scaffold where you can actually do things inside of those little balls here that you see here. So this model was really cool because it was dreaming up with generative models the molecular structure, dreaming up the topologies, and discovering, in the computer at least, state-of-the-art type materials. Now you see the problem. So far, I've been telling you AI discovering nice materials with the computer. We're going to lead into the robots because obviously we need to start making them. But before that, let me just make a small sojourn on representations, because what is a molecule? I mean, that's an interesting paper on its own, right? What is a molecule? You can imagine that ultimately it's a quantum mechanical object. I was just talking to Adriana about quantum computing and things like that before the seminar. But it could also be thought as a string, right? Strings are programs for graphs, as I'll be telling you in a second, or graphs, or bag of bonds. And I think it's fair to say that of all the representations that see here, people have done interesting work in AI for molecular systems. It's just which representation matters for which problem, okay? So I want to just tell you something that my lab has been working on a lot and some progress on it. It's a string representation for such molecules, because the traditional representation for molecules scores miles that you see here. It is interesting because it tells you, this is a MDMA, a drug molecule, a molecule that you might want to take if you want to be in a trip. So you go C and C, you can see it here. The parenthesis C gives you this branch, and you continue, and this number 1 and this number 1 here represents this closed loop here, and then these oxygens here, OCO2, represent this end of the molecule. So you could, in principle, figure out the rules of this. But if I have a generative model like ChatGPT or something, it could, for example, decide to avoid a parenthesis or something like that, and that will be a typo, so to speak. So we developed a representation that it is now heavily used by many researchers. It has the advantage that by using a rules table and thinking about the grammar a little bit different, it's a higher level in the Chomsky hierarchy of languages than the previous one, allows us to have a string that is 100% representable for molecules. And why is that interesting? Because even a random shuffler, okay, is actually better than some generative models. So now you have a real baseline. Generate random selfies. And if you explore chemical space of random selfies, sometimes you do better than some of the published models, okay? And so that's pretty cool, in my opinion. But But the insight that I want to share with you is that really selfies are computer programs. They can have subroutines. They can have, logic in them, and we're working on that in my lab. And I'm going to show you an example of that. Well, let me say I'm going to skip this. Let me show you an example of why that's powerful. In this paper that we call Keys, keep it simple, we use a simple RNN. And right now, the transformer-based neural networks, ChatGPT, caught the world by storm. It's incredible, right? I mean, there's research in chemistry done with it. We're about to put a paper on the archive with it. It's beautiful. It's a fantastic story of all the corpus of human knowledge. But what if you take all the corpus of molecular structures? For example, these are actually very large molecules that we had access to in different databases. If you throw autoencoders to them, they all fail. Like certain machine learning models that were designed for smaller molecules just crash. They can't handle this type of large molecules. So they had to be re-engineered. Whereas if we actually do these molecules atom by atom, and this is a cool thing, we can generate all the way down to small proteins and proteins bound to antibodies and things like that my group is working on. And this is just with the simplest possible recursive neural networks. If you use more advanced models, you can even get perhaps better performance. But that tells you that selfies are very important when molecules become very large and complex because they are 100% valid. So that was pretty cool. But now we went beyond that. We said, well, can we have the cake and eat it? Because some of the biological people might say, Alán, you can represent this protein by amino acids. You can say alanine, my favorite amino acid, alanine, glycine, etc. Why are you representing it by atom? Well, of course. Well, we have something for that. We just released just a couple months ago or 3 months ago the group selfies, which is basically a complete rewrite of the code because it requires much more different logic to actually now have the users define any fragments that they want. And what is really cool about it is when you shuffle selfies, you get a big chemical variety, but if you shuffle group selfies, you remain more or less in the same chemical family, okay? More or less, okay? So that allows you to actually have more sensible chemical space searches just by some random shuffling, but also do really cool things like, for example, add what is called chirality, which is a handed symmetry of the molecules that could be either local chirality, like this one's over here, or even molecular chirality, like helices and so on, by programming smart groups into your group selfies definitions. And that will allow us, obviously, to use language models in a better way, and also have searches over molecular libraries. Okay, so this also was amazing because both selfies and group selfies, the main code has been done with heroic undergraduates, Andy Kai and Alston Law, undergraduates at the University of Toronto. So, of course, mentored by my grad students and postdocs with the heavy coding of the libraries. So now, that tells you, okay, Alán, there is a lot of work, and we talked a little bit about models and then about representations in chemistry. But now, what do you do with the predicted molecules? And this is what I'm interested in telling you about self-driving labs. So, I mean, the automation aspects in science, I mean, that's very old, but automation for biological synthesis is as old as 1966. Here is a paper from Rob Merrifield of the peptide synthesizer that doesn't look very different to the automated chemistry robots of today, actually. And this paper, that is actually about 60 years old, led to his Nobel Prize in 1984, when I was only, myself, I was only 8 years old. Okay, so for the development of chemical synthesis on a solid state matrix, right? The first paper that I have found about self-driving labs is from 78. It's a paper by Winkov from S&K, from what is now GSK. You can see there the loop that is trying to optimize a chemical reaction using BASIC in a PDP-11 microcomputer that looked like this at the time, okay? So you can read the abstract there. So optimizing chemical reaction parameters using the simplex algorithm, okay? So very interesting. So while now the modern incarnation of self-driving laboratories is what Winkov had here, notice his cycle there, right? We found this paper after we published this paper with this figure that it has exactly the same cycle, right? But the modern version, of course, involves, I was talking to Professor Adrián Lozano, about HPC, and he was telling me about how he uses 1 million CPUs for a year, something incredible. So you can imagine having HPC coupled to the self-driving labs, even at that scale, for molecular and material calculations. You have to have AI for optimization of reaction conditions, bias corrections. You have to use a lot of human-computer interaction for the validation. We have played with like chatbots in Slack, for example, and in general connect to the equipment, which you have to connect then to robotics type of things, like robotics operating system. I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. So I will argue that there is a huge area, and students and postdocs in this area, students and postdocs that are considering having their groups or doing postdocs or something like that should consider these kind of open research questions in the area of self-driving labs. Okay, so now for applications, I'm going to tell you an application that I'm involved in a DARPA project that is called Madness, but the application has to do with one of the biggest frauds in scientific history. If you haven't actually read about this, I recommend you to buy this book and put it on your toilet for your toilet reading. Okay, great book about how can somebody fake scientific data. We should all be worried about that. Replicability is a huge problem, and by using chemical databases and storing all our data generated with robotic equipment, we actually save ourselves from these problems. In particular, in this case, Hendrik Schön was his name, was inventing organic semiconductors, organic superconductors, etc. that were fantastic. Okay, and he was fooling incredible people at Bell Labs just by showing so well fake data until eventually his castle of cards fell. And you can read the book; it's a beautiful story. One of the molecules that he was actually trying to come up with is solid-state organic layer-emitting lasers. Chihaya Adachi here, one of my heroes in science, was a postdoc at the time, and Chihaya was trying to replicate his fake data. It took him all the way to 2018 to actually generate long-lived, and for long-lived we call hours, so tens of hours, organic molecules that can survive in the same architecture as an OLED phone, like this. I'm showing it in my chat screen. So same type of layer, multi-layer organic molecules that emits light and lasers. And why would you want to lace? Well, you want to lace, I learned from Chihaya, for having augmented reality. Okay, so you can have very, very directed emission from the screen. So you can imagine having a transparent screen in your glasses that actually shows you, I don't know, the next email from your dean or something like that. I really don't want to have email in my glasses, but that's the kind of application, for example. And why organic? Well, for the same reason that we want to be organic in the LEDs, we want to be low cost, versatile substrates, we can tune the colors. For example, I found out there are no good solutions for yellow or inorganic lasers, really. So a yellow organic laser is a great idea. Okay, so this work couldn't have been done with these collaborators, and this is part of what I've been telling you. This idea of the localizing labs around the world. This project called Madness really is carried out in these 5 labs around the world, and we have a weekly call. Actually, turns out it's Thursdays to talk about this project. And this is my lab at the University of Toronto. We have a synthesizer, an HPLC characterizer, and then a laser system that is used actually to characterize the lasers. And of course, this is a multidisciplinary audience. So what I can tell you is that this is the absorption spectrum and emission spectrum of an organic laser measured by a laser, which is quite funny. One of the key quantities that you want to minimize is the overlap between these two curves, because that is related to reabsorption processes that make the laser stop working. And then you want to measure how fast the molecule emits light, which is the second parameter here that we can measure inline in the robot. So this is how a self-driving lab looks nowadays, right? I mean, you have something that makes the molecule, something that separates it, something that measures it, and a huge Python empire of code that actually runs the thing. And we're about to release several of our Python code packages this year. Actually, some of the drafts are also on my desk for a trip into Mexico next week. So this is kind of like the Hello World paper. It just appeared early last year. Actually, it appeared in the fall, but we submitted it in the archive early last year. The robot made 40 molecules by changing the core components here. You remember the molecules that I showed you from Chihaya, they have this kind of like very, very large organic type linear structures, okay? So I'm not going to talk too much about the chemistry, but everybody likes to watch videos of robots. So I'm showing you perhaps the most expensive balance in the world or something, right? Almost, I don't know. But this is a balance that uses RFID tags for those powders that you see in the bottom. And then actually, again, most expensive salt and pepper shaker in the world is now actually salt and pepper shaking, that little palladium catalyst into the balance, and then the robot arm can take it back. What is really cool about this particular robot, in my opinion, is that it's so easy to program that in the morning my students come in and all the powders are really weighted and ready to transfer to this other robot where we carry out the reactions. This is a traditional ChemSpeed top-down robot. Now, this robot costs about $1 million. This is a big barrier to chemistry, and I'm going to come back to that at the end of this talk. But anyway, you can see how this robot, which is technology like kind of from the 90s, has these reactors where you can actually powder dose and then liquid dose and etc. This another robot. This is kind of like a bottom-up robot. This costs only about the $40,000, all the parts included, maybe even less, like 20. This robot can do more or less the same as the robot that I showed you, but it's all handmade. I'm showing you the robot from behind, but it's basically a bunch of pumps and simple vials where we do the reactions, and that's like a heater, right? So you can actually see that the kind of hacker version of these robots is actually very important. And this is a robot that is a replication of my friend Marty Burke's robot at Urbana-Champaign. But you can see our lasing compounds already being very active there. This yellow compound there is actually a good laser after the reaction happens and so on. That gives you an idea of more or less how you could also use this machinery, and we actually do. So what is really cool about this plot, and perhaps the most exciting plot my lab made since the 5 years, in some sense for me at least personally, since the 5 years that I had the idea of the self-driving lab execution, at least in my lab, was this one, right? Because what we have here is the game. This is how good the molecule is a laser. State-of-the-art molecule is this green molecule. And here, just already in these 40 compounds, we have better molecules than the best molecule of Chihaya. Okay? These molecules, the higher they are, the better. And what you see here in the right is actually the emission from a solid-state laser in Chihaya's lab in Japan. So molecules that we scaled up, we sent to Japan, you showed us a laser. And here we can then show we're actually making organic lasers with us, self-driving lab. But at the moment, the lab just did one iteration. It didn't use AI or anything. It was just the first Hello World experiment. So since then, we've been working in what we like to call ACDC, the project that actually allows us to do the labs, the molecules all around the world. Okay, and for that project, we had to have a detour. We have to work together with my friend Marty Burke and Bartosz Rybowski. We had to work in devising new conditions for our molecules to be synthesized. So we used Bayesian-optimization algorithms, which many people in this seminar probably used for many different aspects of their research. We use Bayesian-optimization algorithms. I'm just checking my time, just to make sure I'm not wasting. Yeah, I'm not going to count time. To find the best generic organic reaction conditions for the reaction that we use, which is called the Suzuki-Miyawara coupling. Now, for chemists, that was a big deal. It was published in Science. And I think it's a big deal because the last type of general conditions, this JAX benchmark, was what Marty came up with his students over several years. And we, in about 6 iterations of AI, of Bayesian optimization over a diverse set of substrates and a lot of human thinking as well, we're able to demonstrate that we get about a 50% improvement in our machine learning general condition generation of random molecules. That is huge, okay? Because the combinatorial space that we're going to be doing now is going to be a space of about 160,000 molecules, where we have 3 blocks done in 2-step synthesis. So we need to do 2 Suzukis sequentially. The caps bring into the bridges, and then the bridges bring into the core in those 2 steps in a single pot. And therefore, you have to cascade the success rate of 2 Suzukis. So if the Suzuki rate was low, then the success rate of the larger product was low. So I'm skipping all the organic chemistry. What I'll be showing you more is how do we think about running 7 labs at once. So I am about to put on the archive the paper on Organizer, okay? Which is I'm gonna skip this. Well, okay, I'll tell you about it, and then there are other things I'll tell you about. Organizer is a code that allows us to organize the 7 labs around the world in the manner that you see on the slide. Now, you have to do AI for so many different things. For example, the initial condition sets you want to use based on chemical diversity to start your search. And you can see for the chemists in the audience or chemical engineers, some of the variety of the molecules that appear in the initial diversity set. I like this laser here because it really looks like a spaceship, for example, very different than the other lasers. And we are able to use retrosynthesis and forward synthesis predictions to actually find the entire chemical network of molecules that can be synthesized, and then characterize which ones we should be making and which ones we shouldn't be making. What is behind all of this? It is a series of works by my lab, and many others have worked on this as well. Alexei Lapkin in the UK, for example, in Cambridge, has similar work. Some work as well, of course, coming out from Klaus Jensen's lab at MIT, and others where we're actually thinking about the best way of optimizing chemical reactions, right? And in this particular case, we use categorical variables, which means, this or that, ligands, groups, and also continuous variables, such as temperatures. And also combine the different objectives into a single function by a hierarchical way that we call chimera, which is basically a function that glues the different objectives. So in some sense, if you want to first optimize one property up to a certain threshold, you optimize a property and then you move into the subspace of the next property and the next property. For example, it could be yield, turnover, reaction time. And over the years, we have demonstrated this with a variety of collaborators. Maybe there's, I would say, between 5 and 10 papers with collaborators in this type of space, using this with different algorithms. But now I want to show you something interesting. So now, after a year since we did the Hello World, we have and 6 months of optimizing the reaction conditions and some downtime of the robot, we have about 500 good data points in a hypercube to start a proper Bayesian optimization. But before starting the proper Bayesian optimization, we needed to find what is the best way to predict an organic laser. And this is where we were stuck for a while because the R-squares that we had were about 0.5. So in other words, with all the measurements that we have about our molecules and all the properties that we have and calculations, the best we could have gotten to predict if a molecule is a good organic laser or not is about R-squared of 0.5. And the reason of that is because one of the 3 properties that we need to predict for a lasing is really not very well described by any descriptor. Okay, so 2 out of the 3 we can predict very well, but 1 of them we can't. So the combined prediction is about 0.51 with our best model, which in this case is a Gaussian process. But we had to work in collaboration with my former student Benjamin Sanchez-Lengeling at Google. He gave us the idea of thinking about basically ranking-based models. So we are starting to work. We're working already with a new novel, at least we believe it's novel, ranking-based Bayesian optimizer. So first of all, we had to even define the features. Before, there's this thing called Kendall-Tau that basically is this product of concordant and discordant pairs. Concordant pairs are pairs that have the same sign, plus plus. So if I predict something is plus, greater than something, and is greater than something, that's concordant, and discordant is the opposite. So the problem with that metric is that, well, there's many problems with that metric, but one of the problems is that it weights concordant and discordant things equally. I can get into details later. But what we do here is make it, first of all, differentiable. So it can be an objective function for neural networks, sorry, a loss function for neural networks, or it could be, in our case, coupled with the Gaussian process as is the weighting parameter. And what it allows us to do then now is, by using this tan IH, which is kind of like a softened version of this, allows us to actually rank the molecules in a much better way. And the tau W, the modified tau W that we invented, gives us 0.91 quote-unquote regression. It's apples and oranges. But that 0.91 really means that about 0.91% we can decide if a laser is better than the other, okay? And that is a trick that allows us to now go ahead and optimize, because we really don't care about the absolute values. We just care if a laser is better than other lasers, okay? So I recommend people to look at ranking-based optimization. Now, this is the software that we're about to put on the archive, organize it. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's a database that controls several robots across the world, right? But what is really nice is like labs around the world should start thinking about, if you have collaborators, how can you have data science that allows you to scale that? Those were some of our laser molecules. Here are some of our users across the globe. And literally we have users in Poland and users in Guadalajara-Champaign and users in Japan and so on, right? So, but this is a database. You can see our different fragments. And then at the moment we have 4 synthesis machines. And we know which fragments are in which laboratory, and we can also then add more robots, or I can just move on and show you my favorite part. We can even see which molecules are synthesized in each lab, and track the shipment of the molecules with UPS, which I find really cool. So FedEx or UPS, we know exactly where the molecules are as we're doing this delocalized synthesis across the globe. And again, this is great because then you can get an idea of what's happening. So I think there's going to be more and more of that delocalized science. I really didn't want to show you our latest results. So I'm showing you results from about actually a year ago. Okay, there's many reasons for that, but I want to surprise the world later when everything comes out. But you can see here, Chihaya's molecule is pretty superseded by tons of our molecules. And some of the properties of our molecules are interesting. They're zigzag. We can learn more about the physical chemistry of them as we move along. And I'm noticing the clock. I have about 10 minutes. I want to leave 10 minutes for questions. I just want to show you a little bit of a musical video of our organic lasers as they are synthesized. They are perhaps the brightest molecules in the world. Anyway, I get very excited about it. So now maybe in the last 10 minutes, I just want to touch base in what could be the lab of the future. So I do not necessarily think the lab of the future is going to look like the 90s technology I showed you before. The convergence of cheap robotic arms and computer vision can allow us to think about labs that look like this. This is how my lab looked about 2 years ago when we started the project of computer vision assisted robotic synthesis. So you can see here, the robot was taking pictures of that transparent glassware and those QR codes called April tags to actually generate a data set of tens of thousands of pictures of glassware filled with water, without water, occluded, etc. And that data set allows us to, in 2001, to have the record. Actually, a Coral, we published the record in transparent object detection by using the depth sensors that get confused by glassware because of the reflections that come out in the glass, plus RGB cameras, and also some models of the glassware that allow the model to actually predict better how glassware looks like and so on. And that allowed us to have that record in 2021. And there's a series of papers where we think about two-dimensional and three-dimensional detection of chemicals in chemical environments, right? And transparent glasses. And what is a foam, what is a solid, what is a liquid, what is a material, right? So that's the kind of thing that we've been working on. And we just submitted, it was accepted also in Coral last year, this multi-vision transparent object detection. By the way, this is work led by my computer science collaborators, Florian Scruti and Animesh Garg. I am the chemist collaborator. But now we're using virtual data. What you see on the right-hand side is not only the experimental data, but now we have a huge rendered visual data set. And then we have different perspectives that we can use to inform our model and then convolve all of these different perspectives and of course, collect them into a complicated computer vision network that you see over there, like ResNet, okay? All the details of this, probably some of them are over my head. They are basically the work of, again, my student, who is basically now a student of Animesh and Florian. But you can see the different computer vision databases. Ours has all sorts of different surfaces and weird glassware with weird reflections. And it's transferring very well to the laboratory as well, okay? That synthetic transparent object detection dataset. There's also very interesting optimization problems. For example, here you see my student Naruki is working on pouring. Okay, these are called actions. I forget the name in computer science, but I forget the technical term of actions. I think they're called tricks or something like that. But basically, to pick up glassware without pouring it, we even had to add another degree of freedom to that particular robot. And this is basically Naruki's work. He's also a chemist working with robotics people, Kurosh, that here is Animesh and Florian. And what we show in this paper, okay, that was submitted to a computer science conference, is a fully automated solubility experiment. It's still using April tags for detecting the compounds. It's not using the fancy system that we have in MB-Trans. This is what we're integrating together as we speak. but you can see a full chemical experiment being carried out. And for that, we had to incorporate many different layers, something called KDL, which is a procedural language of chemistry, the task and motion planning for robotic constraints and robotic positions, and then the robotic operating system coupled to our experimental equipment, so that the robot arm also can be connected to the same database and the same system as the balances and the heaters and so on that can also be computer controlled. So we're about to release also code bases that allow you to use the ROS operating system with chemistry, so that you can actually now do experiments. And you can see how important is, of course, constrained pouring. This is an example that we did in the lab, of course, not with water, but an unconstrained trajectory will actually throw all the stuff, whereas the constrained one actually works. And these actions, this pouring action, for example, we had to figure out what is the best controls to be able to pour. And Alán, you might say, well, maybe it's better to use a squeeze bottle, as you see over there in the bottom. And we are about to submit a paper on our first 3D printed pipette, which is the next level, right? So to get better precision than the pouring here, which is done by doing this, then you can have better precision by squeezing a bottle, and even better precision by using a syringe pipette that we designed. And believe it or not, there were not other open source designs like the one we needed in terms of a very inexpensive robot controlled pipette that really literally uses a syringe and 3D printed parts, and allows us then to actually continue this research, right? So just wanted to show you kind of where we are in terms of the different, higher level and lower level activities for doing robotic chemistry at this stage, right? And with that, then the last topic, literally in my last 5 minutes, okay? So I'm perfectly on time, is philosophical in nature, and we have a paper on this that I'll tell you about. And there's the idea of scientific understanding, okay? So what do computers really need to do to actually advance science? So we had this paper in Nature Reviews Physics that just appeared last year. It literally probably was about a year and a half of work on my lab. All of us just thinking philosophically. Actually, we read people's philosophy of science. And this is mainly led by Mario Kren, which is now a faculty member in the Max Planck Institute, a junior group leader in the Max Planck Institute of Light. And with Mario is basically mainly responsible for this classification, okay, which I also took part with in discussions, and of course the others as well, which is thinking about the three different ways that we use computers for scientific discovery. The first one is, okay, we're doing molecular dynamics, quantum chemistry. I was just talking to Adrian about his direct simulations of fluid dynamics for aerospace applications, okay? And those are what I like to call stage one, computational microscope. We learn by measuring properties directly from a simulation. Extremely powerful. Then, what everything I told you before until now in this talk is number two, resource for inspiration. Basically, statistics, machine learning, we can do ranked optimizations, we can look at outliers, that we can inspire ourselves from the outliers to actually think about the phenomena and then maybe find new physics, for example. But the human brain is the one responsible for that. Obviously, now with the vogue of ChatGPT, this paper came out before the recent vogue of ChatGPT, we were thinking about the agent of understanding. Well, can the computer learn concepts? And you can probably tell I am on the side a little bit of Jan LeCun and others, and even Gary Marcus. Obviously, these large language models appear intelligent, but they are not. They are just parrots. I mean, this term that is being used, right? Stochastic parrots. So to really have scientific understanding, an android has to recognize the qualitative consequences of a theory, okay? And then apply it in a new context. So this, of course, hints very heavily to causal machine learning models, right? Models that actually understand what is the cause of something and start thinking like, what causes what, and then they can infer what's next. And the second thing that we have that probably is easier, right, than we think now with large language models, is that once it understands that cause, it tells it to you in English or French or Spanish, right? It actually explains to you, okay? That means that it's not enough that the robot understood and generalized, that he needs to transfer to us. And this is in philosophy and science, when somebody, some philosophers of science believe that the only way you can say that somebody understood something is by having it explained to others. And there's many professors here in the room probably, and you know that's absolutely true. The first time I taught quantum mechanics is the time I really understood a few of the concepts, right? Some of the concepts I thought I understood as a grad student, but it was really until I taught them that I really understood them. And then finally, with that, I'm gonna just show you a picture of my research group. And thank you for your invitation. And again, extremely sorry I was not there in person due to the snow. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, thanks a lot, Alan. Perfect timing. So now we are open to questions. So we can do two things. So you can, if you just want to tell your question, you can just raise your hand and then unmute yourself. Or you can also use the chat. I see that there are two questions in the chat, so I'll read them right away for you, Alan. So there's a question by Fan Wang Meng. So when using Bayesian optimization, such as the Gaussian process regression, how would you select the kernel function?
Oh, thank you, Fan Wang. I would say when we use very traditional kernels when we use GPs. The details are in our papers, but for example, for molecules, you can just imagine having Gaussian kernels, things of that sort. For example, over Tanimoto distances of molecules. That is the simplest possible one. But sometimes in some of the applications, and I'm tip of the tongue moment right now, we use other kernels, which I'll tell you in a second, but I forget this second. And then there's another question by David, right? I didn't talk about other.
There's another question by David. Maybe we can also go to Yao Yu Pen, that he wants to ask the question.
Okay, Yao has more questions.
So please go ahead.
Please go ahead.
So yeah, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes, Yao, if you want to speak, I can. We can certainly continue talking about this. I'll try to find a paper from.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, well, thanks for the very nice talk. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, so I just have a question about I really like the last part we're talking about, maybe the philosophy part about what models can really understand, what not. Many people are having maybe conceptions about now the AI models can solve everything that we can do, and our scientists don't have to any jobs anymore. So I really like this part. I just because I just want to ask CQ, or maybe your opinions now. For example, to enable true learning of new chemical physical principle. What is the biggest barrier right now, the current model for doing that? Because right now many situations, maybe the models are just learning statistics of data in the data, so they will not do well. For example, for extrapolation type of test. But what do you think was the biggest barrier that let's say the model can truly learn new physics, new chemistry principles, and how to achieve this step?
Yeah, so that's a super good question, Yao. I think again the general field, and if you go to NeurIPS, you will see many different approaches. The general field is causal models. One example, one of the ones that we're thinking about using. In those, you have a structure, say a graph, right? That is being the edges of the graph actually are going to be the vertices are going to be these causes whatever. So the vertices and the edges will be the causal relations, and your task will be to learn that representation, which basically is your statistical way of thinking. Oh, this causes this, right? How to do it? There's different ways. People introduce noise in the inputs and try to find if there's correlation or not with certain outputs. I am not an expert on that. I started working with my group in general on this idea, and I am looking for collaborators as well. But that is one of the areas I have identified. In the paper, we thought better, okay, what are the questions that we need to ask? And what are the metrics, like a Turing test that we needed to have to figure out if a computer understood, right? That's the goal of that philosophy paper, is what are the two conditions, the ones I showed, that are necessary for me to believe a computer understood something. So we started with that more philosophical kind of first goal. And now technically, I think it will be these causal models. And again, I downloaded a few papers. I'm happy to send them to you. But as you know, the field of machine learning grows exponentially. So whatever I send you is probably going to be a few months old of the state of the art.
So thank you so much for the answer.
But happy if you send me an email, I'll dig out
Okay.
the papers I have in my folder.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
So we have two questions, or three even, by David. One is related to reinforcement learning for chemistry. So if you can comment more about the most efficient active learning algorithms related to self-driving labs, or also related to the second question, I think, like what would you take, what would it take to build a universal self-driving lab along the lines of Turing-complete computers?
I love that question, the universal one. Let me begin with the RL. Yes. So of course, David, in most cases, RL requires hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands, even trials sometimes. And therefore, if I'm doing RL with liquids and powders, then I don't want to be spilling in my lab 100,000 times tequila, for example, because we're building right now, for example, a cocktail maker. That's our next task. Before going really for a full lab, we're going to make cocktails, just as a preview for our MIT colleagues. But so we are building a digital twin. My friend Animeshgar has a digital twin feature. So once we have a digital twin that understands fluids and understands a couple of the chemical reaction conditions, and for example, that a strong acid cannot, be mixed with a strong base without care, what we call chemical safety constraints, then we're going to unleash it to the world so people can start testing RL algorithms. So at the moment, we're not using RL as explicitly for the latter part of my talk, if that's what you're talking about. Even in the earlier part of our talk, I mean, we're talking really low data problems, like 300 data points, so we're using just Bayesian optimizers, no RL. Okay, so but RL will become more and more important once we have these digital twins, I think, and then we can actually do a lot of experiments. And our goal is to finish the digital twin paper this year, and then have people be able to play with a certain lab to do chemistry, and then we can have competitions to see who does the best robotic control there. And then your second question about the universal lab in the Turing-complete computers. Well, I mean, it is very hard to say that. Okay, so let me explain. So yes, you could imagine saying, well, I'm going to make all possible molecules and materials, and for that, what are the operations that I need, right? My friend Lee Cronin keeps talking about the fact that his KDL language is Turing complete. He keeps saying that. I don't think he really knows as well what does that really mean. Okay, so it's a little bit vague, right, to say that a chemical procedure is Turing complete, in my opinion. But let's just imagine what that completeness will look like in terms of chemistry. You should be able to carry out all the basic operations that people believe are necessary to do a molecule, right? That's kind of the more experimental way of thinking about it. I should be able to heat, stir, filter, etc. That's the way kind of I think Lee is thinking about it. I don't know if you really want to call that Turing complete, but that's what you're using quotes, which I like too. But the point of that is his programming language, KDL, that I also adopted, allows you to describe all those operations. So that's one way of thinking about it computationally. And then that is transformed, in my case, to a extension that we call robotic KDL that has to do with the arms, because he uses pumps and we use arms. And then furthermore, planning description languages and other AI tools to actually do the planning. Okay, so I think that's kind of like the computer science aspect of this. The experimental aspect, I'm extremely excited, okay, to tell you that the University of Toronto is building a building called the Acceleration Consortium. It's actually 3 stories high on top of the chemistry building, full of 6 actually self-driving laboratories. One is at the University of British Columbia, our 7th. This is confirmed, it's happening. We're going to start digging the ground in July. And we're going to have, in that sense, complete. We're going to have a polymer robotic lab. We're going to have a solid state lab. We're going to have a drug discovery lab, and so on. All of them with a common software interface. But of course, the specifics, right? To make a powder is very different. A solid state inorganic powder is very different than making, for example, a formulation for a drug. But all the different common layers will be in our software stack. So from the engineering side and from the application side, we also want to be complete. Okay, so I don't know if I want to call any of that Turing complete, but I'm happy to call that materials complete as much as we can. So we're going to be able to try to make materials in different classes in this robotic laboratory that we're building. We are going to be hiring, for any MIT people here, this is the most important announcement of this talk, okay? We're going to put an ad for hiring about 34 staff scientists for that, equivalent to like national lab researchers. This is kind of like a position that pays you more or less like a national lab researcher and lasts at least the 6 years of our project. We want to make it self-sustainable. So if anyone is looking for alternatives to faculty positions or staff positions where you really want to do self-driving labs in this call, stay tuned, follow me in Twitter or something, and then I'm very happy to, of course, post the ad about these positions that are going to be posted in a matter of weeks. So we're hiring 34 staff scientists to do that.
Okay, I think that there is also one question by also David that is related to how does it look like when you design a lab for, I mean, from the ground up for self-driving, and in particular, would it be a closed loop microfluidic platform or something similar to that?
So yes, David, we have microfluidics in our universal set of potential hardwares for what we're building in our facility. So you can imagine microfluidics and pumps and continuous synthesis, like for example, flow synthesis might be the future. But I am more pragmatic. I believe some things are better done in batch, some things are better done in flow, and we should have both systems. And the second thing where we are a little bit more, I don't know if more pragmatic, but pragmatic is, why are we thinking of the robotic lab? Let's make the analogy. Adrian was telling me in passing that he's using thousands of GPUs currently for his research. And the GPU is a commodity, right? The GPU, the reason we all use GPUs is they came from the gaming industry. The ARMs are becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. There's $1,000 ARMs nowadays, right? The glassware has been historically designed in a certain way, like the chemical flasks. So it's very attractive for us to imagine that for the developing world, you could buy a $1,000 robot arm and you could use regular glassware. And we also believe that fluidics, anything like microfluidics or whatever, has a problem of clogging and has a bunch of problems with the pumps. The pumps can foul, things like that. Okay, so I have a lot of experience working with collaborators where the robot is down because the pumps are fouled and stuff like that. Whereas if you really use chemical glassware and batch synthesis, you can avoid that by taking a clean glassware and do things and then have some other robot glass wash the glass or something, or a human. So I do believe that not everything is going to be on-chip microfluidics, but one of our labs is actually organoids with microfluidics for drug testing. So we're going to have a microfluidics initiative in our institute, but I am not really married to any platform. The one I'm most excited about is the one that looks more like a human, just because a lot of the chemical procedures in the literature are described for humans, and therefore I believe these terms will be useful. But I totally believe, David, that there's a space for what you're suggesting. I just believe it's not as general as what we're thinking, at least at U of T.
Okay, and I think we are already over time. I have a very quick question. It's more a curiosity to ask you, Alan, related to your field, and because you have so many applications, and it somehow will connect with this agent learning. So did you ever learn anything from a machine? Something that it didn't come from a human? Not that you interpreted the data from a machine, but that you learned something and the machine tell you this is the solution. And you, oh, I didn't know that, now I know.
That's the paper. In our paper, we asked 80 scientists for that question. The SI of my paper contains all the questions and all the answers to our question. We asked them that question in an email, and we asked them how. And that's how we catalog their answers into computational microscope and into data insights, or data-driven science, right? So some people said, I was looking at this data set, I found this outlier, and now because I found this outlier, I understood this particular new phenomenon, right? So we have that in our paper. We have examples of all the scientists beyond us. If you're asking me personally, for example, those zigzag molecules for organic laser is something that we're thinking about. They came out from the data. And then in terms of the next level design will be that the computer explains you why, right? That's what we're trying to say in that paper. Nobody told us, the computer told them why it happened. Of all the people we surveyed. So I think that's the barrier, Adrian. And if we can do that, say, for computational fluid dynamics, it will tell you, oh, this particular thing is wrong and you should change it or something. Or I learned this new physics. That's, I think, where the first person that does this will be revolutionary.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thanks a lot for the great talk. I think it was very interesting. Also for the rest of the people, yes, you can reach out to Alan if you want to. I'll definitely do that, and we'll keep in touch. And I hope to see you next time in the next seminar. So just stay tuned for the announcement. Okay. Thank you, Alan. Thank you.
Invite me when there's no snow. I do apologize. For those that don't know, there are these Porter Airlines flights that very little snow just stops them. So anyway, thank you, everybody. I love to talk to my colleagues at MIT, and then I'm going to give high five to my friend Connor, and I also know Feliz Frankel in the audience. So I want to thank you guys for coming to the talk. Yeah, thank you, Adrian.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.